this video we'll be looking at animal nutrition and human nutrition. Now, to understand these two, we need to know how food is obtained, and that is done in two ways. So either an organism being autotrophic or heterotrophic. Autotrophic organisms can make their own food, so this includes plants, some protists and some bacteria, and this is done generally through the process of photosynthesis. And then heterotrophs, which we are a part of, cannot make their own food and have to obtain their energy from outside sources. So this includes animals, fungi, and then some bacteria. Now, why do we need food? Why is it important? So firstly, it provides energy, and that we get when we eat food that has carbohydrates and fats. Those provide the most energy. Secondly is for growth and repair of damaged tissues, and this is done when we eat proteins. And then lastly, regulation of body processes, and this is done when we eat foods that are high in vitamins, contains water and mineral salts. Now, there are three modes of nutrition that you need to know that are found in animals, and I won't be spending a lot of time on this because you know them quite well already, because you've done this in grade 8 and you've repeated it quite a few times since then. So the first one is herbivores. These are plant-eating organisms. Carnivores are meat-eating organisms, and then omnivores are a combination of the two, being able to eat plant and meat food. Now, the food that heterotrophs eat needs to be broken down into simpler soluble nutrients. So when heterotrophs first acquire their food, it's generally in an insoluble form, and this is where the process of digestion comes in. Now, before we get to the process of digestion, we need to understand the 5 main processes in nutrition that occurs during this larger picture, and it is ingestion, which is the process of taking food, drink, or another substance into the body by swallowing or absorbing it. Then the process of digestion, which is the mechanical and chemical processes. We'll look at that in a following video in the body that change the food to a soluble form. Absorption is when that food was digested. The end products are absorbed into the bloodstream, into the small intestine. Then assimilation is when the cells absorb nutrients from the blood and use it to build new cell structures and compounds. And then egestion is when the undigested remains are removed from the body during defecation in the form of feces. So we'll be looking at each of these processes in more detail in the next video, but for now we're just going to look at the digestive system and understand the different organs and how they function. So the digestive system is made up of the alimentary canal and then the accessory organs. So the alimentary canal is a very long tubular structure, and it is made up of the mouth and the mouth cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and anus. So it starts here in the mouth, goes all the way down the esophagus, into the stomach, into the small intestine, makes its way around the coiled structure, and then heads into the large intestine, and then the last bit, which is the anus. So this, if you remember from our work we did in term 1, is what we would call a through gut, and it's just there so that we can digest food a bit more efficiently and we can get the utmost nutrients out of our food. So that is the alimentary canal, and then we'll also be looking at the accessory organs, and they include the tongue, the salivary glands, the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. So looking at the first portion of the alimentary canal, which is the mouth cavity. So the mouth cavity is lined with mucous membranes, and then the roof of the mouth cavity has got a very hard, ridged palate. So if you stick your tongue just behind your teeth to the roof of your mouth, you'll feel that it has this hard, ridged palate, and that is your hard palate. And then if you stick your tongue just to the back of your throat, you'll find that it becomes softer, and that is known as the soft palate. And dangling at the end of the soft palate, if you've ever wondered what that thing is called, it's called the uvula. And the function of the uvula is actually to close the nasal opening so that food doesn't go back up into your nose when you swallow. Now, I'm sure some of you have had the unfortunate experience of having food go up your nose, and it's very uncomfortable. I don't wish it upon anybody. So part of your mouth cavity is also your teeth and then your tongue, as well as the salivary glands, which we'll look at a bit later on. So these are known as the accessory organs, but what you need to know is the function of the mouth, and that is that it starts the process of mechanical digestion, so physically breaking down the food into smaller particles so that it can be easily swallowed. And while you're chewing, it is also mixed with saliva. And just for interest's sake, I don't know how many of you know this actually, that saliva contains enzymes, and your food is already starting the process of digestion with these enzymes breaking down especially starch in your mouth. So 30% of starch is already digested in your mouth before you've even swallowed. Just a little interesting fact. So that is the mouth cavity. That's all you need to know there. Let's move on to the next portion. So now we'll look at the pharynx, and the pharynx is basically your throat. So the pharynx leads to two openings, which is the esophagus, and then it opens up to the larynx, which will eventually become the trachea or the windpipe through which you breathe. So the function of the pharynx is very basic. It's just a common passage of food and air. Now, if you swallow, there is something, because these two tubes are very close to each other, there is a structure called the epiglottis, this little flap over there, that as soon as you swallow, the food will press against that and it will close this opening that leads to your windpipe so that food doesn't go down your windpipe and causes you to choke, but it actually gets to travel down the esophagus, which sits behind your windpipe. Now, once again, some of you, I'm sure, have had the occurrence where food has gone down the wrong pipe and you've had a nice coughing fest that ensues after that, so that you can get the food particles out. Next, we'll look at the esophagus. So the esophagus is the hollow muscular tube that connects the pharynx to the stomach. So this is where you want the food to go in. So as soon as you swallow, the epiglottis will close so it doesn't go down the wrong tube, and then it goes down into the esophagus and leads towards the stomach. So when you chew food and just before you swallow it, that shape that the food takes, a roundish shape, is called the bolus, and that is what you will then refer to food as after you've swallowed it as the bolus. Now, the esophagus uses peristaltic movements to push the food bolus forward. So peristaltic movements are those involuntary muscle contractions that will squeeze the food down as it travels. So as the bolus moves down, the muscles behind the bolus will contract to make sure that the esophagus pushes down and the food can finally reach the stomach. Which brings us to the stomach, which is a very important organ. It is a sac-like organ, as you can see over here, and it is located just below the diaphragm. Now, the stomach itself is very thick and muscular, and the reason for that is because there's lots of strong acidic digestive juices inside the stomach that needs to be contained within it, otherwise it can get very dangerous. And then the cardiac sphincter is a ring of muscles. So the cardiac sphincter will sit over there, and it's a ring of muscles that will just stop anything from going out again. So that is the opening of the stomach, and then the exit point of the stomach is characterized by the pyloric sphincter, which is also a ring of muscles just below that will control the opening and closing of the stomach into the small intestine. So the function of the stomach is that it helps the process of digestion further by causing churning movements. Now, the best that I can use to describe this is if you think of a cement mixer, mixing the cement the whole time, the stomach does the same thing to ensure that the food, the bolus that is just entered it, gets mixed with all of the acidic juices, the digestive juices that will help digest the food further. So this then takes the form of physical or mechanical digestion, and it just makes sure that the food is mixed with those gastric juices. Then there are glands in the stomach that secrete these gastric juices for digestion, and then finally the food will leave the stomach, but now it is called something different, and it is known as chyme, and this is a semi-solid state that the food is in then. And so it's basically that bolus just mixed with all of those acidic gastric juices. Now, gastric means of the stomach. So whenever you talk about something and use the word gastric, it means relating to the stomach. So that is what we're going to refer to the food as from now, is that it is chyme. Next, we'll look at the small intestine, and it consists of 3 layers, and it is extremely long. So it is about 5 to 6 meters in length, which is very long. And the small intestine, like I said, consists of 3 layers or 3 different sections, and that is then the duodenum, the jejunum, and then the ileum. So those are the 3 sections of the small intestine. So the food moves through the small intestine also with peristaltic movements, and those peristaltic movements also just ensure that the chyme is then moved forward, and it makes sure that it is further mixed with other digestive juices that will be added into the small intestine. So very interesting is that the small intestine has these finger-like projections called villi, and these villi have even smaller finger-like projections coming off of them, and those are known as microvilli. Now, the villi is very important, and the reason they have these finger-like projections on them, and then even on the finger-like projections there's more finger-like projections, is just so that it can increase the surface area, and that is also why the small intestine is such a coiled structure, is also to increase the surface area and to ensure that the food doesn't go through the system too fast. Think of it if you are driving on a highway, for example, from Witbank to Pretoria. If you're driving on that highway, you are most likely going to be driving at 120 kilometers an hour because the road is nice and straight and you can just go. Whereas if you are on a mountain pass somewhere, maybe you're going to Hoedspruit, and if you go through those mountain passes there in the Drakensberg Mountains, you are not going to be driving 120 kilometers an hour. You're going to be driving 60 kilometers an hour to make sure you come around the bends nice and easy. And that is why the small intestine has such a coiled structure, so that the food can move through it slowly, so that there is time for absorption, and that is where these structures come in. And we'll look at them in more detail when we go look at them in the next video actually. But just so you have a general idea of what they look like, so inside these villi, or a villus singular, you'll have a structure or capillary networks that will bring oxygenated blood to the villus and then take deoxygenated blood back. And then this light blue section here is something that we call a lacteal, and that actually forms part of the lymphatic system. And it's quite interesting why that is there, and we'll get back to that in the following video. So the functions here of the small intestine is to help mix the digestive juices and then also absorption. And part of the villi is that they have these structures called the crypts of Libacune. So it's this little structure on the left here. And they also have another structure called Brunner glands, and I'll try and look for another diagram, but you'll find Brunner glands also just going down to the side. So the crypts of Libacune also secrete digestive juices, and they play a role in digestion, whereas the Brunner glands secrete an alkaline fluid that will help neutralize the very acidic juices that were coming out of the stomach into the small intestine, so it doesn't damage the small intestine. And then, like I said, the millions of villi increase the surface area for absorption of these digested nutrients. Next, we'll move on to the colon. So the colon is also made up of 3 parts, and that is the first section, which is the cecum, over there in the light blue. So the cecum actually attaches to the last part of the small intestine, which is the ileum, and they are separated by a sphincter muscle there called the ileocecal sphincter. And then part of the cecum is also a appendage that is attached to that, and that is called the appendix. I'm sure most of you have heard of the appendix, so we'll get back to that in just a bit. Then the next portion of the large intestine is then the ascending colon, so the portion going up, then the transverse colon that moves across, and then finally the descending part of the colon that goes down, and that will then come into the last portion of the large intestine, which is the rectum, and then the rectum finishes with the anus, which is then, well, opens up to the rest of the world. Now, the functions of the colon is to secrete mucus to aid in digestion, so to make sure that the food is nice and lubricated, so the chyme is nice and lubricated so that it can easily exit. And then water, bile salts, and vitamins are also absorbed here. And then undigested waste is stored before it is digested through the anus. Now, as you can see, water, bile salts, and vitamins are absorbed here. So if somebody is constipated, that is generally because of the absorption of water that takes place in the colon. And that is why somebody will then become constipated, is because all of that water has been drawn out, so it makes the passage of the feces very difficult because it's not as lubricated as it was before. Just in case some of you wondered where constipation comes from. Now, the appendix is quite an interesting little organ, and there was quite a lot of debate early on what it was used for. A lot of people are still doing quite a lot of research on this because not a lot of organisms have it. So primates, wombats, rabbits, and us, we have an appendix, but other animals like dogs and cats don't really have it. So it is quite an interesting little piece or structure. Now, the function that they've recently come across, and I've copied the link into the description tab at the bottom of this video, is it actually has immune functions. So it assists with lymphocyte production. And what they believe is that the appendix actually exposes white blood cells to antigens in the gastrointestinal tract, so that the white blood cells can get to know all of these antigens and can build up an immunity to some of the pathogens that might come in. So the appendix is also interestingly used to reconstruct bladders if a bladder is removed. So a part of the small intestine will then is removed and will function as the bladder, and then the appendix is actually used to form the sphincter muscle so that the person still has control over their bladder, and they can basically, well, they're able to able to retain urine. Now, a lot of people believe that the appendix will actually become a vestigial structure, which you'll learn about in matric when we do evolution. So it's basically structures that will disappear over time because they are not being used or they don't have any use, such as wisdom teeth or the pelvis in a whale. Those are all examples of vestigial structures. Next, we'll move on to the structures and functions of the accessory organs. So this includes the tongue, the salivary glands, the pancreas, and then the gallbladder. So starting off with the tongue is a muscular organ, and it also has small projections on the tongue known as papillae, and they actually contain taste buds. So the main function of the tongue, it serves as a taste organ, but then it also assists in the chewing process by pushing and pressing food against the hard palate and between the teeth, making sure everything gets nice and mixed. And then it also ensures the mixture of food with the saliva, and then it also helps with rolling the food into a bolus and then pushing that to the back of the throat so it can be swallowed. Next, we'll look at teeth. So there's actually a formula that you need to know with regards to teeth, and that's just how the jaw is broken down basically. So you have the upper jaw and then the lower jaw, and then the teeth formula is for 1/2 of the upper jaw and 1/2 of the lower jaw, because you'll know that the other half also has the same amount. So in humans, we have 2 incisors, so these ones over here, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and then 3 molar teeth. So that's just on the one side of the upper jaw. On the lower jaw it will be the same, so 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and then 3 molar teeth. And that will then be repeated on the other half. So how do you write this? This is how you write the formula. So the top portion is for the upper jaw, and then the lower portion is for the lower jaw. So once again, there are 2 incisors, these ones. Then there's 1 canine, 2 premolars, and then 3 molars in that specific order, and it will be the same for the lower jaw as well. So you need to know that. Now, once again, the function of the teeth is just to help grind down the food and get it into a more soluble state. Then the next is the salivary glands. So there are 3 pairs of salivary glands, and they are the parotid gland, which is located below the ears. Then there's the submandibular, or the lower jaw gland. So mandibular actually means lower jaw, so it sits, that's the other one, so it sits over there, the submandibular gland. And then the last gland is the sublingual gland, which sits right below the tongue. So lingual means to speak or talk, so that has to do with the tongue, and that is why it's known as the sublingual gland. So the functions of the salivary glands are to produce and secrete saliva, and this also makes it an exocrine gland. Now, an exocrine gland, exo meaning to the outside, it releases secretions into ducts, whereas an endocrine gland, endo means inside, it releases secretions directly into the bloodstream. And we'll look at that in more detail next year when we do the endocrine system, but just so you know the meaning of the two. Next, we'll look at the pancreas, which is this yellow tongue-like structure here. And the pancreas is actually a very important organ, and it is located just below the stomach. Now, the pancreas has 2 types of cells. It has pancreatic cells, which secrete pancreatic juice, and then it also has the islets of Langerhans, which secrete two hormones, insulin and glucagon, which are very important with maintaining a good blood sugar level. So the pancreatic juice is secreted via the pancreatic duct, which is this over here, and then it eventually joins the common bile duct, and they then empty into the small intestine. And the pancreas is both an exocrine and an endocrine gland, because the endocrine function here is with regards to insulin and glucagon that are released directly into the bloodstream to control the blood sugar levels. So firstly, it secretes pancreatic juice with enzymes that play a role in digestion, that is directly released into the small intestine, and then the other is it secretes insulin and glucagon that control the blood sugar levels. So that is the function of the pancreas. The next organ is the liver, which is this very large triangular structure that sits just above the stomach. So the liver is actually the largest gland in the body, and it consists of two lobes. So my drawing tablet doesn't want to work now. This lobe over here, and then the smaller lobe just to the side. And the liver cells that produce bile is transported away and stored into the gallbladder, which is that green little structure you can see over there. So the liver produces bile, and then it forms a common duct that empties into this small intestine then. So the functions of the liver, it produces bile, and the function of bile is actually the digestion and absorption of fats. So it changes them into fatty acids. Glucose is also converted into glycogen in the liver. Excess glucose is converted into fat, and then excess amino acids are broken down to form urea during a process called deamination, which we'll still have a look at. And then the liver is also detoxifying, which means that it absorbs and neutralizes toxins such as alcohol, and then important vitamins A, D, E, K, and B12 are stored in the liver. So you can see why people eat livers, because it's high in those vitamins as well. And then also it produces heparin, which prevents blood clotting from occurring. The next little structure that we'll look at is the gallbladder. So the gallbladder is located between the two liver lobes, and then it contracts and releases bile when stimulated. So the bile produced by the liver is stored in the gallbladder, and then that is then released into the small intestine. So a lot of you will know that the gallbladder actually can form gallstones, which is these rock-like structures you can see up here, and that just happens when the bile inside the gallbladder starts to solidify. And this can be very painful and even deadly if it is left untreated. So these gallstones can either go down, and then they block that common bile duct, and what will happen then is that the bile starts building up inside the gallbladder. It can even push up and go to the pancreas, which is very dangerous as well. Sometimes they don't even go out, or they don't even get into the common bile duct, because some of these gallstones can be as big as a golf ball inside. So they can either then be removed by putting a tube in there. Generally, if they're in the common bile duct, they can be taken out, or it happens that the gallbladder itself is just removed completely. You will still be able to digest food. It's just you can't, generally they'll tell you not to eat as much fatty foods as before, because the bile itself helps to break down the fatty foods. And that is the end of this first video. In the next video, we'll be looking at all of these organs in a bit more detail to see exactly how digestion takes place.